just want to double check if it's recording. Okay. So today's lesson is the development in modern China, which is on page 23 of the study guide. And we are hoping that by the end of this lesson, we'll be able to outline the role of the Communist Party of China in the development agenda of China, and we'll be able to discuss issues in China's current development and also in relation between China's development and the global South. So we know that China's economy is successful because there's a lot of talk around it in it becoming the center of the world's economy. They say in not such a distant future. And then it reminds us that 40 years ago, China had minimal contact with the markets of the capitalist world, and most of its people were based in agriculture. And then by then it had neighboring states such as South Korea and Taiwan, of which China claims as a province, that had displayed more amazing levels of growth. So South Korea and Taiwan had actually progressed better than China back in the days. And but today China is the world's most populous nation and has an economy growing at about 7% per annum. This is being achieved principally through export to the global capitalist market, yet politically, the Chinese Communist Party remains firmly in control. Now, what is going on then? This learning unit is going to acquaint us with aspects of China's modern development by regarding its successes, but also its major internal problems, which relate to environmental degradation, inequality, welfare, political accountability, and financial regulation. So it tells us that there's a lot of literature surrounding modern China, and they give us an example of the John Gittings literature and Zeng's literature. It states that, okay, they view China as a case of uneven and unequal development. That's by Shegung and Angang. Moving on to the next section, what is the role of the Communist Party in the development agenda of China? So the Communist Party of China has been credited with the sudden transformation of the Chinese economy, especially post-1978. Hong suggests that the process of political economic reforms in China could be accredited to the highest leadership of the Communist Party of China and the subsequent decisions of the National Congress of the CCP. Hong also notes that the success could also be linked with numerous factors outside of political leadership in China. For example, he does acknowledge the theoretical contribution made by the Chinese academia in the structures of the political economy. The astute leadership of the reforms dictated the nature of economy rising in China. Hong argues that the success of China's economy highlights the superiority of the socialist economic system and development path with Chinese characteristics. It also tells us that the Chinese do the economy their own way and then compares it to Africa, who they say still clings to the frameworks of Western developmental models. So everything highlighted in red currently is Africa, relates to Africa. So it clings to the frameworks of Western developmental models, despite contending voices that Africa should disembark the Western forms of development and economies. Now, for this module and sub-theme, this assertion could still be crucial to shed some light on why Africa has failed its developmental post-colonial agenda. Among other approaches adopted by the Communist Party, one was to embrace the role of the private sector in the Chinese economy, while the party has co-opted, which means taking control of something such as an idea, movement, or resource for one's own purpose, usually by absorbing or redirecting it into your own agenda. That's what co-opting means. So while the party has co-opted entrepreneurs into its ranks, it has also been encouraging its members to seize
Sorry, guys, am I the only one that lost audio?
No, you're not the only one. I think
No.
mornings are not for you.
Okay. Hi, guys. Can you hear me?
Yes, but we lost you for a bit there.
Okay. So what is the last thing you heard me speak about? Let me see if this is recording.
Yeah, it's recording. I think you were still talking about the approaches before it went like silent. Yes.
Okay. So, okay. Among other approaches, was that what I was saying?
Yeah.
Okay. So among other approaches adopted by the Communist Party, one was to embrace the role of the private sector in the Chinese economy. While the party has co-opted entrepreneurs, in brackets, that's the meaning of co-opting, if you can see on the screen, co-opted entrepreneurs into its own ranks, it has also been encouraging its members to seize opportunities of venturing into business following reforms that were instituted in the 2002 transition in the CCP politics, when recruitment of entrepreneurs into the party was legalized again after its banning in 1989. There has been increased cooperation between Chinese business tycoons and the CCP. As a result of the support which business receives from the CCP and the state, Chinese business tycoons have reciprocated by giving maximum support to the CCP and eventually gaining cooperation with the state. The reforms define the qualities of the leadership within the CCP. The CCP leadership was motivated by a desire to see improvement of the lives of the Chinese people, which they contended would improve with creation of jobs in China. The CCP set up an administration interested in genuine development of the poor Chinese citizenry. As you can see, what is highlighted in red right now is comparing to Africa. Unlike post-colonial African states, whose interests were not provision of service to the masses in order to improve the lives of these masses, but consolidation of self-enrichment ambitions by amassing state and private resources at any available cost. Contrary to China, where the CCP and the state gained the confidence of the citizenry, post-colonial states in Africa received disdain and questioning of legitimacy in return. African leaders in mainstream politics and party politics lost the trust from the masses which had earlier trusted them. The CCP directs the direction of the Chinese political economy, whereas post-colonial African states lacked these aspects. We find that the CCP ensuring that state-owned enterprises in China were governed in accordance with strict regulations because they were the mainstay of the Chinese economy. However, in Africa, on the other hand, party politics invaded SOEs for personal gain and access to resources, thereby risking their viability and successes as economic institutions meant to assist states to fight poverty by generating crucial capital. This is all on page 24. As I said, the red part is what Africa does, the green part is what China does. Now, issues regarding China's development. An issue in China today is whether rapid growth is sustainable or whether the problems produced by growth will force that country to pursue a more conservative and regulated course, or whether it will lead to a political and economic crisis. This is because China has experienced an increase in popular protests despite tight political control by the government. The second issue is whether the single-party authoritarian leadership of the CCP creates significant problems in the current context, necessitating democratization, or whether the party is the indispensable guide mentor, and executor of a long-term plan, necessitating protection of the party and continual improvement of its ability to function. Then another further issue concerns the decline of agricultural and environmental conditions as a result of the capitalist marketization of the economy. In many parts of the countryside, there's an overuse of fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides that has led to degraded soil, decreasing yields, and the contamination of water bodies, eutrophication of lakes, the hardening and crusting of soil, and progressive soil erosion, and a decline in rural health. It remains to be seen whether the combination of problems will be manageable. Problems such as the emergence of a very rich classes, the unemployment of some 200 million rural workers, many of whom try to flock to the cities, declining educational standards for the poor, the mushrooming of businesses with poor financial regulations, the environmental problems mentioned above, together with massive problems of air pollution and shortages of clean water, as China seeks a route to national wealth and power. China's influence on the world stage has grown enormously, and it has major economic presence in Africa. Another issue to explore here is China's relation to the global south. So now we are moving to the section of successful growth, emerging problems. Hale and Hughes outlined the explosion of market-orientated exports and the massive increase in production, which includes high-tech goods, and in the internal consumption of consumer goods. They show that China plays a key role in the capitalist, global, and regional economy as a major producer of low-end labor-intensive goods and as a major importer of high-end capital-intensive goods. In addition to the issues mentioned above, so the issues are between page 24 and 25, right? Hale and Hugh Hales add two more. Those of China becoming a major global competitor for commodities such as oil, and of China's aging population, which necessitates rapid growth to fund pension provisions. China did not have pension funds even as late as 2003. Now, Nolan argues from a historical perspective that because of the wide variety of challenges facing China, it needs an improved Communist Party-led state to guide it through times of turbulence. Nolan discusses at length the weaknesses of Chinese business, including the realities of weak financial institutions, the lack of research and development, and the lack of integration with the most efficient production systems in each global industry. Furthermore, most Chinese exports were from foreign invested companies. He also highlights the oddity that Chinese tax base is very low. Central government revenue was only around 7%. Okay, then Afith has his own dynamics of the Chinese countryside. Afith, Ho, and Vermeer. They state that reforms to commune system in 1978 led to 2 decades in which agricultural production increased greatly and was aided by a new system permitting lease. Please allow me to admit. Okay, where was I? Okay, at the same time, the development of rural-based industry was the main force for growth in the Chinese economy until the end of the 1900s. So that's Afith, Ho, and Vermeer's take, argument, or opinion. And then it also tells us that by 1997, township and village enterprises provided employment for 140 million workers. And then much of this rural growth, however, through resource mobilization. So resource mobilization is basically expanding production by pulling more labor and capital. And then it says, rather than real efficiency, which is achieving growth or output through actual improvements in productivity and performance. So This rural growth, however, through resource mobilization, good management, growth in productivity, or innovation in production. Because of this, according to AFIRTH et al., growth in China's rural areas slowed down greatly in the late 1900s. So they blame them being, they're talking about the resource mobilization, them favoring resource mobilization, which slowed down the growth in the late 1900s. And the recent spread of capitalist management of TVEs and seeking of foreign funding has led to failing employment in these enterprises. Furthermore, TVEs were responsible for a large proportion of the chemical pollution of the countryside in the 1980s and 1990s. That's a disadvantage of a TVE. Apart from soil and water pollution in rural areas, China also faces severe air and coastal water pollution, as well as water shortages in some provinces. While China has faced severe environmental problems, it has made considerable efforts in the direction of a green government policy. Ho and Vermeer outline the government's well-developed response to environmental problems, but conclude that both business and government may need to be more accountable to ordinary people if China's rapid industrial expansion is not to undermine its own conditions. Now we'll move to the next section, which is the new dynamics, new labor conditions, the end of rapid growth, and refurbishing state capitalism. So after 2010, China entered new terrain because of rising skills and labor costs. As its international influence increased, it began implementing policies of tight state control, but also of development and the collective good. Now, can China's path be used as a development model elsewhere? Gallagher outlines how relations between the Chinese state and workers have changed, as cheap labor from the countryside has declined due to labor demand in an aging population and the implementation of labor laws that gives rights to all workers while abolishing the socialist model jobs for life in urban areas and replacing this with just contracts. So as job security declines, so strong unions have emerged. Gallagher predicts that the Chinese state will have a difficult task in managing labor. Now, the self-assessment activity on 4.1 said that read the article by Gallagher in the e-reserves provided, and then write one paragraph on each of the two tasks stated below, which was the effects on wages and labor supply of the labor laws of 1994 and 2008. So these are direct quotations from that article around this. You guys will create your own paragraph, but I'm just giving you what is verbatim. So the 1994 labor law was the first labor law in the history of the People's Republic of China. It was passed hurriedly after several years of discussion, following a spate of wildcat strikes in development zones in China's coastal cities. The foundation of labor law is the labor contract system, which defines legal employment in China as the establishment of a labor relation via a written labor contract. The other one is the labor law set up standards for working hours, overtime, holiday pay, and other employee benefits. Minimum wage regulations were also put into effect. The other one tells us that the labor contract law of 2008 restricted use of short-term contracts, clarified the punitive clauses for violations, and extended economic compensation for terminated workers. The other one is rising wages coexisted with rampant wage arrears, especially in the construction sector. Stock gaps in social insurance coverage for migrant workers also meant that most workers did not have any safety net if illness or disease interrupted their ability to work. Now, the effect of the termination of permanent urban jobs and their replacement with urban contracts. So the end of the Iron Rice Bowl institutions of the previous system dissolved lifetime employment. Many social benefits of employment were reduced or phased out, and rural migration increased, which created new competition at the lower levels of the labor market. The significance of this transition to labor contracts cannot be overemphasized, especially if contrasted to the previous system of lifetime employment. And then it tells us that by 2005, 35% of urban workers were employed informally, while 90% of migrant workers worked with a labor contract. Now, Copilot, I asked Copilot to quickly summarize this for you guys. So Gallagher traces the legal framework that shaped the labor market. So 1994 labor law, China's first national labor law established the labor contract system, which defined legal employment via written contracts and set aside standards for working hours, overtime, holiday pay, benefits, and minimum wages, plus a pathway for dispute resolution, which was mediation, compulsory arbitration, and litigation. Aspirational coverage was designed to include migrant workers, regardless of hukou or firm ownership, but implementation lagged. Then the 2008 labor contract law and 2008 mediation and arbitration law, these measures restricted short-term contracts, clarified penalties, extended compensation for termination, simplified procedures, extended statutes of limitations and reduced fees, and aimed at bolstering worker protections amid rising inequality and labor shortages in manufacturing. Despite stronger laws, Gallagher emphasizes the high standards, low enforcement reality. Protections on paper were often undermined by weak local enforcement, informalization, and labor subcontracting. By 2005, 35% of urban workers were in informal employment and 90% of migrant workers had no labor contract. Okay. Now we're moving to another section. McNally agrees that China has reached a crossroads. He links this to a dangerous bubble in the housing market, aligned to credit expansion. He also links it to 6 imbalances in the economy. 1, China has a rich state but poor people. 2, there is too much saving by government and households. 3, there is a sharp income inequality. 4, there are great imbalances between urban and rural areas. 5, coastal regions are much richer than the interior. And 6, there is a lack of environmental sustainability. Now, McNally argues that China has a convincing state-led strategy to address common problems through focusing less on economic growth alone and more on a refurbished state capitalism that is attempting to rebalance the political economy by promoting consumption, urbanization, the service sector, and industrial upgrading. A central aim of the strategy is to improve the state itself. The Chinese state under the CCP is, for the most part, not liberalizing economic governance in favor of market-based dynamics, but rather aiming to refurbish itself to more effectively guide a socially inclusive political economy. So the second activity was, having read the summary provided in this learning unit under 4.2 above, note the different roles played by the CCP to influencing business and entrepreneurship in China, and compare this influence with that mentioned by Matai on post-colonial Africa. Okay, so these are the exact words of the roles that are played by the Chinese Communist Party according to the study guide. The Communist Party of China has been credited with the sudden transformation of the Chinese economy, especially post-1978 transition. Hong argued that the success of China's economy highlights the superiority of the socialist economic system and development path with Chinese. Among other approaches adopted by the Communist Party, one was to embrace the role of the private sector in the Chinese economy. While the party has co-opted entrepreneurs into its own ranks, it has also been encouraging its members to seize opportunities of venturing into business following reforms instituted in the 2002 transition in the CCP politics, when recruitment of entrepreneurs into the party was legalized again after its banning in 1989. As a result of the support which business receives from the CCP and the state, Chinese business tycoons have reciprocated by giving maximum support to the CCP and eventually gaining cooperation with the state. The CCP set up an administration interested in genuine development of the poor Chinese citizenry. I'm just rereading the information from above, you know, just to get your minds going back and forth. We find the CCP ensuring that state-owned enterprises in China were governed in accordance with strict regulations because they were the mainstay of the Chinese economy. Now, if we compare this with post-colonial Africa, Africa, for example, still clings to the frameworks of Western developmental models, despite contending voices that Africa should instead disembark the Western forms of development and economies. Unlike post-colonial African states, whose interests were not provision of service to the masses in order to improve the lives of these masses, but consolidation of self-enrichment ambitions by amassing state and private sector resources at any available cost. In Africa, on the other hand, party politics invaded SOEs for personal gain and access to resources, thereby risking their viability and successes as economic institutions meant to assist states to fight poverty by generating crucial capital. African leaders in mainstream politics and party politics lost the trust from the masses, which had earlier trusted them. Okay, so that answer, you'd have to combine it around that information. McNally, 2013-67, believes that the success of China's state-led strategy strengthens the argument for liberal market policies that are tempered by state regulation and state guidance. But what does Chinese state-led capitalist development imply for the global South? According to Vidal, Ramos, and Neves, the major effect on the global South is not the influence of China's development model itself, but rather the political and economic spaces opened by the Asian consensus, which constitutes a new network power between PRC, the People's Republic in China, and some less development regions, particularly Africa and Latin America. And this alternative network to Western liberalism, there are benefits. Countries of the global South have options as regards investment and finance. China's non-intervention policy within countries invested in contrasts with Western interventionism and is often preferred. Similarly, China's financial aid does not have political conditions. Notably, China's forms bilateral agreements that are tailored to each country. This is what Vidal says. Vidal also further argued that China has key goals in the global South, that it requires more energy and natural resources for its development, and that it needs PRC recognition and the isolation of Taiwan, and that it requires political support with the UN, as well as expanding export markets that include the global South. So in their account, Vidal suggests a marriage of convenience between China and the global South under the Asian consensus, rather than the direct emulation of Chinese policies by Africa or Latin America. And so we go into the self-assessment activity, and it told us that we should have gone to the Vidal article. And then it speaks about an outline. So what I did was, I'm going to skip this information. I try to understand how to draw an outline, right? For me, it sounds like an essay, but it's shorter. It's more bullet points instead of full sentences. So an outline is like a similar structure to an essay. It's just got bullet points. Okay, now let's answer this question. Briefly outline how the Asian consensus differs from Washington consensus neoliberalism. State what the global South derives from the Asian consensus, and state what China derives from the Asian consensus. Okay, so I took exact words from Vidal. So how is the Asian consensus, how it differs from the Washington consensus and neoliberalism is this. The Asian consensus is above all a dynamic, commercial and investment network power, commodity extractive orientated towards the Southeast geo-economic area, which is a new kind of North-South relationship. Asian consensus AC emerges in a context of WC, Washington Consensus, disruption after 2001 economic crisis in a renewed and reformatted hegemonic neoliberal globalization. As you can see, these are all straight from the article. Washington Consensus helps to implement neoliberal model of adjustment and reform that includes the unilateral liberalization of trade and finance, privatization of state-owned companies as fast as possible, shock therapy in order to adapt and discipline those countries into the right way of modernity towards the first world. And then what the Global South derives from the Asian Consensus is, it says it's the possibilities for greater political room of maneuver for developing and underdeveloped countries. China's growing economic presence in Latin America and Africa emerges as a new commercial and financial option for the South, in contrast to the hard constraints of the WC. New trading opportunities, investments in energy and natural resources and infrastructure, and financial aid were very important for recovering these economies. Now, what China derives from the Asian Consensus? The Public Republic of China, according to Vidal, needs more and more energy and natural resources to support its domestic development. Another important factor that stimulates the expansion of the PRC to the Global South is the chance to obtain political support in the multilateral forums and international organizations. Finally, Latin America and Africa are potential consumers for Chinese products. Now, co-pilot's answer in asking it, how the Asian Consensus differs from Washington Consensus. Okay, so the Washington Consensus, it promotes neoliberal reforms, rapid privatization, unilateral trade and financial liberalization, and fiscal austerity. It imposes stringent conditions through IMF and World Bank loans, limiting policy autonomy of developing countries. It represents a north-south asymmetric relationship embedded in neoliberal ideology. Then the Asian Consensus, it emerges as a dynamic commercial and investment network power after the disruption of WC post-2001 crisis. It is anchored in bilateral trade and investment agreements, commodity extractive orientation and infrastructure development. It avoids political conditionalities, emphasizes non-intervention and pragmatic economic cooperation. It offers greater flexibility and room for maneuver for developing countries compared to the WC. And what the Global South derives from the Asian Consensus is this: new economic opportunities. So that's in the form of trade, investment in energy and natural resources, and infrastructure development. The other one is financial alternatives, which are Chinese loans and aid without IMF and WB style conditions. Political space, more autonomy in global negotiations and reduced dependency on Western institutions. And then recovery support, it helped Latin America and Africa rebound after neoliberal crises. And then what China derives from the Asian Consensus is access to energy and natural resources to sustain domestic growth, political support in multilateral forums, example, United Nations and the isolation of Taiwan, and then expanded export markets in Africa and Latin America to diversify beyond the US and European Union. And it also strengthens global influence through bilateral agreements and strategic partnerships. That's the end of that exercise. Now, moving to the study guide again. It has been argued that Africa can learn from China's internal agricultural policies. Zayun et.al. argued that the smallholder-based agricultural policies developed in China might be particularly useful in some African countries, despite great economic differences between China and these countries. They argue that China has sustained smallholder farming on small plots in times of technological change through high-density farming, joint services, and extension services provided by the state irrigation, fertilizer use, and a consistent agriculture-centered development strategy and staple food crop-led agricultural policy honed through an incremental learning process. Now, these authors believe African agriculture lacks solid government backing and a strong pro-agriculture policy, long-term commitment, intensive and labor-saving strategies, the use of improved seed and fertilizer, approved tenure that facilitates common strategies, and a political environment in which smallholders can exert their influence. Now, they believe that if African countries get their smallholder policies right, the China case shows that both food-based systems and large-scale agriculture can exist side by side, and that many mutual benefits can be derived from their coexistence. That's on page 27. And now we move on to the self-assessment activity, and then it tells us to read the article on e-reserves by Zaiwan, and then we must draw tables. So it tells us to complete one table by listing the differing agricultural conditions in Africa and China, and use sections 2, 3, and 4 in the article for this purpose. These sections are called the historical conditions for agricultural development in China, and section 3 is the agricultural policy in China and Africa, and then section 4 is the African policy change, and then section 6 is the politics of agricultural policy. So I now wanted to inquire more about what were these China's agricultural conditions. So this is the information I got. It says historical development. China's system evolved through a long-term experimentation over thousands of years, leading to land-saving systems that focus on intensive farming, such as polyculture and intercropping. Then there's a population pressure. Rising population pushed agriculture towards intensification, improving land productivity, food crop yield already reached 2.7. Sorry, this is just extra information. I haven't started answering the question yet. I'm going to answer the question after I give you this information. Rising population pushed agriculture towards intensification, improving land productivity. Food crop yield already reached 2.75 tons per hectare in the 18th century. Policy orientation. Since the 1950s, China adopted taking agriculture as the country's economic base as a central strategy, prioritizing food crops and irrigation. And then it talks about the infrastructure and inputs. The policy irrigation is essential for agriculture, expanded irrigated areas from 16.3% in 1949 to 49.2% in 1980, enabling adoption of high-yielding varieties, fertilizers, and irrigation. And then the smallhold structure. China's agriculture is predominantly based on a smallholder farming structure, 95.6% of total arable land, with farms averaging 0.003 to 0.11 hectares per capita. Productivity is achieved through multiple cropping, mixed crop livestock systems, and state-provided public goods such as irrigation and improved seeds. And now I wanted to understand also Africa's agricultural conditions from this article. And the historical pattern is this: Africa developed a much less intensive form of agriculture, making use of larger land areas, and currently less than 30% of the potential arable land is under cultivation. The colonial legacy. Technological change focused on cash crops and large commercial farms, which partly explains why the Green Revolution bypassed Africa. The policy trajectory is post-independence policies were influenced by external interventions, shifting from state-led planning to radical and rapid liberalization under structural adjustments, which created an immediate vacuum in the provision of services for the farmers. And then this is still Africa, infrastructure and inputs. Africa faces limited agricultural extension services and a lack of irrigation coverage. All of this stuff is in the article, word by word, especially the ones with inverted comma. Fertilizer use remains extremely low, and it shows us that they use minimal fertilizer compared to China's 158 kilograms per hectare. Irrigation covers only 5% of arable land, approximately 5% of arable land, and costs for development are very high. So yeah, yeah. So it's very expensive to develop the land in Africa compared to China because of the lack of infrastructure. Smallholder systems, although smallholders dominate, production is extensive. Multiple cropping systems are rarely seen, and mechanism is limited due to capital and tenure constraints. Now, in table format, this is how the information would have looked. Differences between Africa and China in terms of smallholder agricultural production and productivity. So see that these are the exact words of the article. They just put in table format. So in China, the origin and evolution of Chinese agricultural structure has been based on long-term experimentation over 1,000 years. And then in Africa, a much less intensive form of agriculture evolved, making use of large land areas. And then the land use and intensification. In China, agriculture has been developed largely based on land-saving systems that focus on intensive farmings such as polyculture and intercropping. And in Africa, currently less than 30% of the potential arable land is under cultivation. And then in terms of technology and development, smallholder farmers have accumulated rice and wheat-based farming technology, providing a basis for modern technological innovation. And then in terms of Africa, technological change was mainly concentrated on cash crops and large commercial farms. The policy approach in China was taking agriculture as the country's economic base has always been a central element of China's development strategy. And in Africa, African agriculture policy significantly most were influenced by external development interventions. Then the irrigation and inputs. The policy irrigation is essential for agriculture, which stimulated the expansion of irrigation areas from 16.3% in 1949 to 49.2% in 1980. And then in Africa, it was limited agricultural extension services and a lack of irrigation coverage, which have been frequently highlighted as limiting African agricultural development. Then the reform style that was used as a consistent agricultural-centered development strategy and staple food crop-led agricultural development policy honed through an incremental learning process. And then in Africa, Africa's liberalization of markets, privatization, and restructuring were radically and rapidly undertaken. And then it said we needed to complete a second table by listing the differences between Africa and China. Okay, use section 5. Okay, so in writing, this section compares how smallholder farming operates in China versus Africa. So in China, agriculture is predominantly based on smallholder farming structure, 95.6% of total Arab land. Most farms are very small, yet productivity is very high because of an intensive family farming system, multiple cropping and crop livestock systems. Chinese smallholders widely use improved seed varieties and fertilizers and benefit from public good provisions for smallholders, such as irrigation provided by the state. Mechanization is increasingly offered through private services, while the state ensures irrigation, extension, and input support. And then in Africa, although smallholders dominate, production is extensive rather than intensive. Multiple cropping systems are rarely seen, and there is a lack of use of improved seed and fertilizers, which is considered a major constraint. Irrigation coverage is minimal, and community-based irrigation facilities are scarce. Fertilizer use is extremely low compared to China, and land preparation and mechanization are limited due to capital and tenure constraints and dispersed land holdings, which increase costs for joint services. Then within the article, they display a productivity gap, which shows maize yields that China produces much more than Tanzania. You see, China is producing 6,750 kilograms per hectare. Tanzania is only doing 580 kilograms, and Zambia is only doing 430 kilograms. This illustrates the stark difference in output and efficiency. And then Section 5 emphasizes that China's success with smallholder comes from intensification, strong state support and public goods provision, while Africa struggles with low input use, poor irrigation, and weak institutional support, resulting in much lower productivity. So now in table format, when we do this in table, we'll see that the farm structure, China's agriculture is based on smallhold farming structure. It tells us about the 95.6% of total arable land. And then Africa, it dominates Africa's agriculture through the average size of African although the average size of African smallholdings is larger. Smallholders dominate Africa's agriculture, although the average size of African smallholdings is larger. The farm size, over 50% of Chinese farmers only have from 0.3 to 0.11 hectares of arable land. And then it tells us that African people have larger land than Chinese smallholdings. Cropping system, multiple cropping is widely practiced and mixed crop life systems are common. And then in Africa, multiple cropping systems are never seen. Input use, Chinese smallholders widely use improved seed varieties and fertilizers. And then in Africa, lack of use of improved seeds and fertilizers has been considered the major constraint. And then the irrigation, it tells us about public goods provision for smallholders, such as irrigation, are provided by the state. And then here, irrigation in Africa is community-based irrigation facilities are relatively scarce. So they lack community-based irrigation facilities. And in the productivity, we saw that China is much more dominant as compared to other African countries. And then we are wrapping up the chapter. And it says that in this learning unit, your focus was on development in modern China. You were introduced to critical areas on the Chinese development agenda. It is hoped that once you have covered this learning unit, you will be able to outline the role of Communist Party of China in the development agenda of China. The material supplied in this regard reinforce the assertion that China's current level of development has to do with the commanding role played by the Communist Party in the Chinese political economy. This role is part of the issues critical in the country's current development agenda. This learning unit was not only about China, but critical appraisal of how China's development agenda relates to the developmental agenda of the Global South. And now that completes the chapter 4. And I copy and pasted assessment 4, right? Which was discuss the economic reforms that led to China's rapid developments since the late 1970s. Also discuss the political, social, economic, and environmental challenges that emanated from such accelerated development. And the prescribed readings that were not stated, but the study guide would have been taken from the learning unit 4 notes. And that brings the end of this lesson. So I guess what you need to do is, why I put this last is because you might just want to inquire about these e-reserves that are required, that are already provided for us, that will help to answer this question. If you go through those e-reserves and then you make your own notes on them in case they could. Well, I know that they can't ask this question. If they do, fine. At least you know the e-reserves and you've opened them. But I do encourage you to find out the e-reserves that are relevant for this, maybe browse through them. And that brings it to the end of class. Now the time is 10 to 6. I don't know if anyone wants to say anything. If anyone wants to say anything. Anybody? Okay, I'm gonna stop recording now. Yeah, so